aspects of the course today. We'll see how far we get, so even if we don't finish, that's okay. We'll eventually get to where we need to go. And if I could just get the next slide. Okay, so today is your opportunity to ask questions, and the sub-theme is actually then some other suggestions about how we're going to run this course. And I also wanted to tell you a little bit about how we're going to try to integrate a lot of different ideas. And we are going to have some guest speakers this year, which is a little different than we did last year. So we will have some guest speakers coming in to talk to you about different aspects. And we're going to start off this year with diabetes and different forms of diabetes. And then we're going to get into how all of these different systems, when we're talking about a specific disease system, how actually they don't just affect one system, they actually affect all of the systems that we are interested in within human biology or within health and disease. And it's actually a really great time to think a little bit about this. You're in a brand new decade. In the previous decade, we saw lots of amazing advances, and we saw lots of really interesting things popping up, and we don't know how the next decade is going to go. And you're going to set the tone for what we think is important in the next decade or so. So is it all good? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, awesome. Thanks so much. Again, just before we get going, as much as I can. I would love it if this group got together as often as possible outside of the tutorials and just form like a recognized study group. It's good for your CV. It's good to learn how to lead a group of students. And these recognized study groups that are run through arts and science actually appear on your co-curricular record. So it's a great way to kind of meet your classmates. It's a great way to interact with me. It's a great way to kind of get a jump start in studying as well. Have any of you taken part in an RSG before? So how was your experience, if you're willing to share? Ooh, okay. I see lots of, Okay, so I'm hoping that when we start talking a little bit about how to get you prepared for like your term tasks and your different assignments, that we'll have some suggestions for you, as well as hearing a little bit of your feedback. So we do have set office hours, so immediately before this lecture from 2 to 3 o'clock over in Wetmore Hall. This is where the human biology program offices are. And we are going to have office hours set every single week. So I'll either be answering your questions online during that hour, or if you need to come and speak to me personally, then I'll be there in the office in the hour before this lecture starts. If you can't make those office hours because you're coming from a different class, let me know. I'm happy to try to set up different office hours for you as well. You're more than welcome also to email me about other matters. So if you are suddenly sick or if you're really concerned about different aspects of the course, just let me know. I'm happy to discuss those with you and use my UToronto email if you at all possibly can. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit of what I'm hoping that all of you are going to get from this course, and to start off with a couple of analogies for you to get us started. Did you guys watch the movie Lord of the Rings? No. I know you watch movies. I know you stream movies. I know you like Netflix. Did you watch Lord of the Rings? No, not a fan. Okay. All right. It's going to be a tough analogy then. Okay. So let's just try our best. So there's this story where at the end, and we're working toward the end. I know we're just beginning, but we're actually looking toward the end of the course. How are you going to finish this course off? And it's going to be a long 12 weeks, and there are going to be some tough times in the next 12 weeks. There are going to be some really good times. You're going to get to know people that you might not have known before, including your TAs, other students in the course. we're taking this journey together. And sometimes I'll be leading it, sometimes your TAs will be leading it, sometimes you'll have to lead it. And this is really what this journey together is all about, learning how to lead and learning like what to communicate with other individuals. And I also wanted to share with you sort of not the Lord of the Rings analogy of like going on this journey together over the next 12 weeks, but also a little bit of what I'm hoping you're going to get out of this course. So do you guys want to do well in this course? Oh, come on. Honestly, you do want to do well, right? Okay, that's not very convincing. I'll make the assumption that you want to all do well. Okay, so we'll assume that. But there's sort of this other aspect, and when I was here at U of T and I was doing my undergrad, most of my courses were not really interesting, to be quite honest. I had to take them because they were part of like my prereq. I had to learn all of these amino acids, their structures, their pKa values. I still dream about them at night. I had to learn all these statistical tables. I had to learn all these different calculations. But for the most part, like when I was in class, I really just was there. I wasn't like really paying attention to the material. And it's a lot like this journey that I took with my wife. So I did my postdoc at Stanford. And one of the last things that my wife wanted to do before we left Palo Alto, she wanted to go on a road trip. And this road trip was like really important to her because it was her last memory of like our time over the last 2 years in California. And she wanted to like take this trip with me together, just like we're taking in this course. And so I had like a very different view of like what this road trip was going to be. So I was like so caught up in like making sure that I planned everything step by step that I missed like all of the good parts of the road trip. I didn't enjoy it. Like I literally was like frustrated by the driving, trying to get to the next hotel, trying to plan where we're going to park, where we're going to eat. And I really didn't enjoy this beautiful trip along the Pacific Coast Highway, one of the best and most scenic routes that you can ever drive. And my wife loved it, but I hated it because like I was so caught up in the minutia of trying to get things done instead of enjoying the process. And I hope that in this course, maybe not always, but most of the lectures, that you're going to actually enjoy them, that you're going to enjoy the topics, or at least get interested in the topics, and not just get caught up in, I need to study this material in order to do well in this course. And I'm hoping that that will come through multiple times for you throughout this course as well. So I'm going to really quickly unpackage this course. So I kind of look at the way that I've envisioned the course as being nice, neat, and tidy. But of course, it's a lot messier. And I don't know if you're going to have any questions or not. But I'm going to try my best to unpack it for you. For all of you in HMB 322, for the most part, I'd like you to try to come to as many lectures as you can. I'm going to tell you why. Like I know that you're all thinking, well, I don't need to be in lectures. Like I've been here at U of T for a while. And I tell you that based on every single conversation that I've had with students, the 2 hours that you spend here is not a wasted 2 hours. The 2 hours that you spend here is 2 hours that you save from having to listen to this lecture online later and then trying to stop it, trying to write down notes and everything else. So I don't know if you can make it to every single lecture. We will record every single lecture. But if you're going to plan to do well, don't look at this 2 hour block as a wasted 2 hours. If you have like a different test right beforehand or right after or the next day, sure, miss that one lecture, but try your best to come to every single lecture because we want to engage you as much as possible. And it's not a wasted 2 hours. So the lectures are important, and this is where we're going to get questions for the multiple choice and the short answers. You're going to also have tutorials. And again, you can miss a tutorial. And again, it's really important to communicate with your TAs because your TAs are the ones that are going to be evaluating like your participation and what you're doing in the course. And these tutorials are where you're going to be learning how to study for the upcoming term test, the final exam, and then also where you're going to be doing your presentations. And we want you to do well. And I know that doesn't sound like it's believable, but we do really want you to succeed, learn how to study, or refine how you study on these term tests. We're going to ask you to do some short write-ups, and we're going to ask you to do some reflection. And that might seem really scary, but we're going to do it in a way that the marks will be reflective of how well you tell us a little bit about yourself, and you'll all do really well. So We'll get into that a little bit later, but I wanted to tell you a little bit of the short write-ups that you'll be doing this year in your tutorials, and you'll have a presentation. So again, just out of curiosity, because you're informing me as well, how many of you have done presentations before? Okay, lots of you. Fantastic. Do you love presentations? Not really. Okay, let me ask you a different question then. Do you like group work? Fans of group work? Right, so everyone's kind of, yeah, it depends, right? And agree, 100% agree. But by the time you get to fourth year or in grad school, like you're going to need to work with other individuals. So it's important, and it's important for us also that you are able to work in a group and to put together like a really good presentation. So the resources that we're going to have for you, we are going to have audio recordings available. We will be having like this webcast. So whatever you see on this screen and my voice will be synced, and it will be made available for you as a lecture recording, every single lecture. And then we're also going to try, depending on you, to develop weekly study guides so that you know exactly what to study week by week. Okay? Does that sound all right to all of you? Do you have any comments, suggestions, things that you would like to try that you've tried in other courses? Suggestions? Do you love the green color of the seats? Honestly, it's just such a fantastic color, right? Amazing color. Any suggestions? Nothing. Okay. All right, it's going to be a long year. All right, here we go. Okay, so this is sort of the mark breakdown. What we're going to try to concentrate on first is that February 4th term test. And this February 4th term test is one that we want you to really focus on. We want you to hit the ground running, get a good mark in that. The final exam is just a bigger sort of version of the first term test, so it'll give you an idea of like how I studied and what I need to improve on for the final exam. And then we'll have like 2 short write-ups for the tutorial assignments of 10%. We're always going to give you like what the rubric is going to look like. We're going to give you the instructions, and wherever possible, we'll be telling you like what the expectations are to do well, like to get an A or above. And then tutorial participation, that will be where you're going to be interacting with your TAs. And again, the tutorial presentation is worth a little bit more this year. There is going to be both a group component, so you'll get a group mark, and then you'll also have an individual mark in addition to that. So 5% for your individual contribution, and then 20% of your mark will be the group part of that. So working together in a group, but also acknowledging your own individual contributions. And then the final exam will be a non-cumulative, everything since that last term test. Do you have any questions about this or anything that I can clear up for you now before we go on? Yes? The presentations will be done in the last 3 weeks of classes. So we're going to be giving you a workshop, and we'll be telling you like how to give a good presentation, or at least what we think is a good presentation. And then what the expectations are. You'll have that workshop. You'll have some time to work on that. One of the suggestions that we had, and I haven't discussed this with the TAs yet, sorry to surprise you TAs, but one of the suggestions was to actually have a draft of the presentation first, beforehand, and then to get some feedback on the draft of the presentation. I think we're going to try that if you guys want to do that, so you can get some initial feedback, see if there are things that you can improve, and then actually give the presentation. So those will be in the last 3 weeks, Amy. Any other questions? Yes? There'll be very short write-ups. So you'll be given some instructions. It'll be related to one of the themes in this course about what you should be thinking about in your 3rd year or 4th year, of like what you hope to do after you graduate, and what you feel like you're ready for right now. So some of it is like just assessing like your own skills that you have now, and then one of the things that we'll ask you to do is to take part in these different types of activities, and then to reflect on that, like how ready you would be to go to grad school, for example. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but there'll be 2 separate ones, 5% each. We're expecting you to do well on those. And it's really just a reflection piece, like what your own thoughts are about how ready you are, what skills you've already developed, and then why you might want to be an epidemiologist, and why you might want to go into med school, or why you might want to go into grad school, or why you might want to be a veterinarian, why you might want to go into an entrepreneurial stream. And it's a tough sort of thought process because most students leave it to fourth year, and that's like not a good thing. You should not leave it till fourth year. You should be thinking about it now, and that's what we're hoping that you'll start that process in this course. Any other questions that I can answer for you? No? Nothing? Okay, all right. All right, so we are going to have a number of guest speakers in this course this year, and we are trying to finalize the list, but we will have a number of individuals who are running their own labs. We have some trainees that are going to be coming in. We have them coming in from a number of different streams, so they're not all from research only, so some of them are in the business world. Some of them have finished like their undergrad degree and decided that they are going to go into communications, like scientific communications. How did they get into that? And how does it relate to some of our topics? And so we are going to have some guest speakers throughout the 12 weeks that we have you in this course. And we're going to talk about a lot of different things. So we'll talk a little bit about the importance of the skin. We'll talk about the microbiome, which is still like a really fascinating area, but we're not so sure about it for the next decade, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about diet and exercise and how that impacts health as well as disease. We'll be talking about some of the different cellular molecular techniques, stem cell models, organs on a chip, organoids, which are really powerful now. And then some of the different genomic approaches to different diseases sprinkled in throughout all of the different lectures. The one thing I want you to take away, when we talk about a disease, we're using the disease as a platform to understand how the rest of the human body responds. So we might talk about cancer that occurs in the skin, but that doesn't only affect the skin. It actually affects a number of different organ systems throughout the entire body. And I'm not just talking about metastasis and it moving from one part of the body to the other. I'm talking about real impacts on the endocrine system, real impacts on the nervous system. And so we want you to understand that this is a very integrated field when we talk about health and disease. Do you have anything in particular that you want to hear about, or anything that you would like to hear a little bit more about? I'm just dying to see like how you do choice on the multiple choice. Like, I don't know. How's that going to work for you? I hope it works out well. No, nothing? No choice? Nothing that you want to put forward? I'm happy to kind of incorporate them. No? Okay. So I wanted to, sorry that I just lifted all of these from your Facebook pages. I tried to pick ones that were a little bit safer. So I also wanted to introduce our TAs who are up at the back, so they're in the back row. So we have Amanda, as well as Tao, Nancy, and Azen. So do you guys want to just, if you can raise your voice just a little bit, do you guys want to tell the students like what your line of research is in grad school? Nancy, do you want to start, or Amanda, do you want to start?
Sure. So, Nancy, I'm doing a master's looking at the effects of cannabis use during pregnancy, what that does to the neonatal brain.
My name is Cal. I am working on blood vessel stem cells and how they're involved in things like high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, things like that. And I'm a master's student in physiology.
Hello, I am Azim. I am a PhD student. I'm working on the effect of extracellular potassium concentration on neurological diseases, specific epilepsy and seizures.
I'm Amanda. I'm a PhD student with the Institute of Medical Science. I'm in mental health research, so looking at depression and suicide risk, specifically after a concussion with brain imaging.
Okay, pretty awesome. So again, I want you to think and maybe like communicate with your TAs about things that you're curious about, like how did they get into grad school, potentially figuring out like if grad school is something that you might want to do, like getting that sort of stepwise progress and how they got to where they're at today. I'm hoping that you'll interact with them. They're really great individuals. I've known them all for a while, so I'm hoping that you'll also get to know them as well. So I think the only other advice that I have before we start getting into the actual lecture material today is that it's easy to come to class, because coming to class, and I do want you to come to class, and I do want you to take notes, and I want you to take notes in a way that is meaningful for you. But if you're just sitting there and just taking down notes, it's actually not studying. So there's a difference between coming to class and then actually studying and preparing for your term tests or for even getting ready for your assignments. So I want you to prepare in a way that is meaningful and is useful for you. So the last 5 minutes of today's class, for example, we're going to compare our own notes. We're going to make sure that we're all on the same page and that you were able to take away what I thought were the most important parts of today's lecture. So we're going to spend that first lecture today kind of going over that at the very end. The other thing that I'd like you to do, and it's really hard, it's easy at the beginning, and it's even easy up until the first term test, but it's really hard toward the final exam season. Try to study weekly. It's really hard. Like, you have to get in the habit of doing that. Don't try to cram, because it doesn't work. You all kind of know that it doesn't work. And it takes a lot of practice for you to get into the habit of doing this. And one of the things that I love about Mariah Carey, so I used to love her when she was a fantastic singer. She still is a fantastic singer, but nowadays she kind of just phones it in. She kind of just shows up, kind of gets the money, and then kind of runs off. And sometimes she doesn't even bother singing. She just shows up, right? And I don't want you to do that. Like, I want you to think about how far you've come here at U of T, where you want to go in the future, and I don't want you to just phone it in. Don't just show up and come to lecture and then jot down some notes and think that you're going to be okay for the term test. You won't. And I don't want you to have that moment where you're going to be worried or anxious a couple of nights before the term test. My job and the job of the TAs is to get you ready and to make sure that you're progressing in a way that is useful for everyone. Of course, you have to have a picture of Miss Mariah Carey. Okay. So I want you to also stay connected as much as possible. Again, it's a pretty big class, and I know it seems like it's really hard to get to know the other 119 students in the class, but try your best to stay connected, to get to know everyone in your tutorial, and then the people who are sitting near you during lectures as well. And we're going to try our best to make sure that you're connected as well, too. Do any of you have any questions? No. Okay. Can I get a volunteer, someone who's good at clapping? Yeah, it's an odd request. Totally know it's an odd request. Someone who's good at clapping and not embarrassed about standing up here at the front. Okay, thank you for being brave. So could I ask you to come up here to the front? I promise you won't regret this. Or you might, actually. Sorry. Okay, so can I just... I'm going to write something on the board. Yeah, of course. Do you know this song?
Oh, no, I don't.
You don't know this song?
I don't, I'm not familiar.
Oh. Okay, then. This is going to be a problem. Do you know this TV show?
Yes.
Okay, do you have the song from this TV show in your head?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right.
With the lyrics?
No.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So I don't want you to sing it. I don't want you to hum it.
Okay.
But you have it in your head, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to clap it out. And if anyone in this class can actually tell me, based on your clapping, what the song is,
Okay.
on your term test that's coming up on February the 4th, I'll give you, like, in advance, like, the full question, the question plus the choices underneath. If any of you can guess what the song, and sorry, what's your name? Essen, what song that Essen is clapping out? It is a TV show, because you heard that. So let's see if you can guess, just based on her clapping alone, not her humming, no singing, no other hints, just based on her clapping pattern, if you can guess what TV show it is. Go for it, Essen.
All right, cool. 1, 2, 3, 4.
remember, this is like up to 3 of your multiple choice, like out of 15. Like 3 is a lot. All right, awesome. Yes, you want to go for it?
Friends.
Okay, we'll keep going. Other hands over there. Anyone else want to guess? Sorry, and what's your name? Omar. Does everyone agree with Omar? Anyone else want to make a different guess? No? You agree with Omar? Yeah. TA's at the back. What do you think? You agree? Okay. So, wow. Okay, so this totally didn't work. So, Essen and Omar and Amanda are right. Like, I don't know how you got that out of the clapping, but it is actually the theme from Friends. Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay. Right, okay. Not sure how that happened. Okay, so this is going to totally ruin my analogy, but thanks, Essen. So you can have a seat. I made a promise that I would... No, I'm gonna post it for everyone. It will be there. I promise. I will do it. I don't know how you guys did that. So, how many of you take psychology? So, in psychology, there's this really famous principle known as the curse of knowledge, and this curse of knowledge is what Essen was supposed to demonstrate, but she didn't, because she actually was able to convey that. So, in your head, you have like all these questions, things that are bothering you, things that you think other people will know about, and that's all in your own head. Just like the theme song from Friends is kind of running through your head now, but no one can tell based on like how you're sitting there or how you're coming to class or not coming to class, like no one can tell. And so it's important for you to communicate because we all have that curse of knowledge. We have our own sort of monologue in our head. We have our own theme song in our head, but no one else can hear it. So it's incredibly important that if you're running into a roadblock or if you are running into problems that you communicate it or clap it out if you're like Essen. Maybe you'll have like a wonderful TA who's like Omar level who will totally get what you're clapping out, but it's better to just talk about it. And it's important for us to know like what sort of things you're going through because we might be able to help. So please make use of all of us. Don't have that curse of knowledge running through your head. Communicate as much as you can. This is a small enough class that I want you to feel comfortable asking questions to the guest speakers, to myself, to your TAs, even to your classmates who are here with you. So please keep that in mind. And I think if you can do that, I would be extremely happy. And that's my expectation for you in this course. So anything else before we jump in? Again, not being a mind reader, I'm hoping that everything is okay. If you need to chat with me or email me, please feel free to do so, but also feel free to be comfortable enough to ask questions at any point in time. All right, so we're going to jump right in then. And this is sort of the first data slide that I'd like you to be familiar with. And we're going to talk about this data slide. And we're going to be talking about diabetes. And if you were to guess, how many forms of diabetes are there? Yes? 3. Okay. How many of you agree? It's Kristen, right? No. Anon. Okay, so how many of you agree we have 3 forms of diabetes? 3? Do we have more than 3? Okay, so there's a hand up at the back. So we're going to talk about all of them in more detail next week, but we actually have 5 forms of diabetes. So most of you will know about type 1 diabetes, and we're going to have a guest speaker coming in telling us about her research on pancreatic cell transplantation for type 1 diabetes. We will start today about type 2 diabetes because I've recently found out that I'm diabetic now. So type 2 diabetes. Type 3 diabetes is something that some people call gestational diabetes. So when you're pregnant, you will sometimes develop diabetes and that goes away. Alzheimer's disease is known as a type of diabetes. It's been implicated as a type of diabetes as well, so that's another type. And then there's an age-related form of diabetes as well, and it's not because of losing pancreatic islet cells, it's not because of insulin resistance, It's for a variety of different factors. And we're going to go through those in the next lecture. But today, we're going to be talking about type 2 diabetes because there's a particular reason why we need to think about type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance diabetes, also known as metabolic syndrome. And it's not just having high glucose in your blood. High glucose in your blood causes lots of problems, and I don't know if you've ever thought about that.
Your mic cut out.
My mic cut out. How do you know my mic cut out? Like the one here in this room? Here? Oh, okay. You're right, it did cut out. All right, thanks. So again, curse of knowledge, would not have known. Okay, awesome. Can you still hear me without the mic? Okay, during the break, which will take in about 5 minutes anyways, I'll switch over the batteries and hopefully we'll get this thing to work. Okay, so the other thing that you can see from this diagram, when we have high glucose that's caused by whatever form of diabetes that we're looking at, so either type 2 diabetes, and now I'm looking here at the right, so either like insulin resistance type 2 diabetes, or we have hyperglycemia brought on by type 1 diabetes. Whatever the case may be, because we are going to eventually cause inflammation through like having too much glucose in the blood or hyperglycemia, we're actually affecting almost every single organ system that you can examine. So we are going to change the way that the liver looks like. We're going to be changing your bone structure. So I don't know if you've ever thought of that. We're going to be changing your nervous system. So the diabetic retinopathy, your nervous system is also affected by high glucose levels. You're going to have heart damage. You're going to have blood vessel damage. You're going to have arteriosclerosis. Your kidneys will be affected. So high blood glucose levels don't just impact or isn't just like related to type 1 diabetes, you're also going to be affecting skin. Your skin is more likely to become infected. Your skin is also going to be healing much more slowly. All of these things are impacted. So what else do you think the diabetes is going to impact? Not on this diagram. So other systems. So having like high blood glucose for too long, what else are you going to affect? So if you think about it from a logical perspective, if your skin is more likely to become infected, which is very common in diabetes, like untreated diabetes, you can get skin infections. What does that mean in terms of another system? What other system is being affected, Essen? The immune system is also dramatically affected. And we've actually learned in the last year and a half of a brand new form of the immune system called X lymphocytes in type 1 diabetes. And so even though we've known about diabetes for a long time, this platform allows us to integrate new information. And we'll talk about X lymphocytes and how the progression of type 1 diabetes occurs in the next lecture. So for the time being, I want us to concentrate on this blood vessel here on the right, which is, again, an area of research that Tao, one of the TAs, kind of works on, and he works on blood vessels. And if we look at inflammation that is brought on by hyperglycemia, uncontrolled high blood glucose levels will eventually cause inflammatory cascades to occur, and this is going to affect the blood vessels. And this is why it causes all of these issues with the heart as well as arteriosclerosis, and it causes the endothelial lining of the blood vessels to be directly affected. In addition to that, if you are following what else is going on, not only are the endothelial cells going to be damaged through this hyperglycemia, so that's one outcome that we'll be talking about, and this leads to heart damage. It also leads to hardening of the arteries. It also leads to an increase in this cascade here. So if you were to tell me based on what you remember from physiology, if I stimulate this pathway, which is what you're seeing, so high blood glucose or hyperglycemia is stimulating the increased production of fibrinogen and is stimulating the increased production of fibrin, what will happen to your blood? It's more likely to clot. And so, again, it leads to a lot of secondary, tertiary, or third level consequences in terms of health and disease. Okay, so again, I've done a lot of talking for the very first class, and there's a lot to kind of catch up on a little bit. This slide, I don't want you to just not worry about it. So I will tell you that there will be something that you'll be tested on from this slide. It's most likely going to be a one-line response or a one-line answer. And it's going to be based on what we've just discussed, not about some hidden detail that I didn't go through. So I didn't talk about calcium and intracellular calcium on this diagram, but something that we've discussed will be on your first term test as a one-line response from this diagram. So don't just think that I don't need to worry about this one. All right, are we good? Shall we take a quick 10-minute break now, and then we'll come back. I'll try to get the microphone set up, and then I'll go through the rest of today's lecture. We'll try to end the first lecture a little bit early. Feel free to talk to the TAs at the back, talk to your classmates. If there are any snacks left at the back, please help yourselves. We'll meet back here again in about 10 minutes.
Hi, Lachlan. How are you? I don't know if you remember me. Yeah. Okay, so I had a question about the. I know. I was like, what happened? But I was happy. Was that for everyone? Or? For everyone. Oh, okay, that makes sense. For the tutorials, so I just realized that there's a tutorial section for this course. Because like I signed up for like fall, and I had no idea. And then all the time slots for the tutorials conflict with my course that I need to graduate. Are you guys going to like maybe make more tutorials or change the times or anything? Because I really want this course, but like all this like there's only four. Yeah. Okay, I'll do that.
What other alternate day?
It's just 3 to 5. I basically have courses 3 to 5 almost every day. So like that time is not gonna. I mean Fridays I'm free 3 to 5, but every other day 3 to 5 I have class. Yeah. I'll email.
I had a question. I'm also taking your today.
Okay.
And then, so right now I have 6 courses, and I'm designing them all. And then I talked to professional didn't know. So I was wondering if I should maybe drop one of them. Because she was like, oh, today, it's like a prerequisite for fourth year.
I think every third year course is kind of a prerequisite for different fourth year classes. Like if you're in health and disease, this is where you do your seminar courses in health and disease. CJH is a prerequisite for different courses in other programs. CJH is offered in the summer, and it will be offered again in the summer if that's an option for you. Yeah, I think people should take their summers off.
Yeah, I just think that's the only preference for me. Yeah, but yeah,
And to be honest, it's not the content. The content is actually less. So we only have 10 weeks right now. Or 10 lecture days. So, but it's okay. I don't yet. No, you can drop in any time, 2, 3, or Tuesdays. You can just
Professor, I'm actually waiting to leave this for this course, and I was wondering if it could be some sort of verification.
Yeah, just send me a quick email and then I'll put you in.
All right, thank you.
It sounds like there might be some.
Thank you.
we're going to get going in 2 minutes. Before that, just a reminder, there are no tutorials this week. They will start next week. And if you're not sure if you're going to stay in this course, again, no judgment. I think if you can try to make up your mind about it as early as possible. We do have a wait list, and we'd like to get the first tutorials pretty solid with like the core group that's going to stay in the course throughout the rest of the year, going as quickly as we can. Realizing that you have a lot of different things that you need to think about for decision making, but if you can do that earlier, you would be really helping a lot of individuals who are on the wait list or who are in the class right now who are trying to get off the wait list. So again, please let me know if I can help you make up your mind either way. We are recording, so if you've missed something, it's a good opportunity for you to go back, jot something down in your notes, and then go back to the lecture recording where you might have zoned out for a couple of minutes, and then come back and look at the lecture recording later on. Okay. All right, and apparently there's no way to actually change batteries on this because it's a rechargeable battery block, which I can't find the recharger for. So I'll use this microphone for the time being, and we are still streaming live on the site, and so I will post the lecture recording immediately after the lecture is done. So as I was mentioning to you, one of the reasons why I'm particularly interested in health and disease is because it's so relevant to me, because I'm always interested in my own health, how my health has been changing in different decades of my own life. So I went in for a checkup, a routine checkup during the break. I was a little bit worried about some of the things that I was kind of experiencing physically. And some of you will also know that I've experienced depression in the past. I've been on medication for depression. And some of that medication for depression has actually caused me to gain some weight. And all of these things kind of made me a little bit worried about some of the different aspects of my health. So I went in and I had my blood tested, and I had a whole bunch of different tests done. And my doctor was telling me, yeah, you are now officially diabetic, so you do need to worry about taking good care of like your health in different ways. And so I wanted to start talking a little bit of like why all of these different aspects of what we talk about is relevant for you. So you might not have any of these conditions, but it's likely because your parents are in the same age group as I am that they're going to be experiencing the same types of things. And let's face it, if you're in life science and you have a parent, they're always going to think that you are already a medical doctor and asking you like, hey, I read this in the newspaper, and do you think this is right? Or should I go and exercise more? Or should I eat this food? So I think it's a good time for us to think a little bit about this. Do any of you know what's in this picture here in the middle? So right here. Any ideas? So I think I hear some of you kind of mentioning it. So these are skin tags. And skin tags are very, very common in diabetes. So having like excess skin, especially around different places where your skin has a crease, around your neck, back of your neck, different places, skin tags are common. And you have to think about this, right? So why does having like too much blood glucose actually have you develop different skin conditions? And I want us to think a little bit about that this is an integrative process, and I want us to start thinking about all of these things in that context. So I'm going to talk about type 2 diabetes, also called metabolic syndrome. One of these things is a very different redistribution of body fat, and this is very common in type 2 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes, we'll talk about more next week. Type 1 diabetes has that high blood glucose. It has that same inflammation, but it doesn't really have this central obesity, and that differentiates it from the type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So I'll also be mentioning that we need to rethink a lot of the classic measurements that we use. So I had my BMI taken, so I had to stand on the scale, I had my height measurement done, I had my waist measured, I had the standard measurements, but in fact, because I'm Asian, and because most of the standards that are developed for looking at health are not based on the Asian or South Asian populations, we actually have to rethink like what that would mean. So what is my BMI, and based on the standardized values, am I obese or not obese? So again, if I look at some of the physical measures for metabolic syndrome, which you will need to know for the upcoming term test, and clinical examinations for the metabolic syndrome that will also be continue on in the next lecture, and that you'll need to know for the term test. I want us to begin that discussion today, and then if we have time, we'll get into insulin and its signaling, because this will also bridge with what's happening in type 1 diabetes in the next lecture. Many of these different systems are affected. So in this background that you don't have on your slides, and that's okay, you can just jot these notes down. Having diabetes actually is bad in a number of different ways, not just high blood glucose, not just inflammation, not just having central adiposity or having too much fat around the midline, but it also affects your thinking. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that before, but it does affect your cognitive skills as well. And so we have to think about this from a multidisciplinary point of view. Wound healing is a lot slower. We've already talked about that. We're going to come back and talk about the effect of high glucose on the immune system and specific immune cells and what that means, how this affects nerves and why we have neuropathy. So your nerves are always like kind of tingly and they feel a little uncomfortable. How does having like too much glucose in your blood affect your nervous system, of all things? Why does it affect your skin? Why does it affect your immune system? Why does it affect your nerves? Because your nerves are kind of hidden behind this blood-brain barrier. Why are so many systems being affected by having too much blood glucose and everything else? So surprisingly, even in 2020, we don't really have a good way and a standardized way to assess metabolic syndrome. Not everyone agrees that it's actually a health crisis. Like type 2 diabetes is something that many medical practitioners still regard as something that that doesn't really require too much intervention. So there's not a consensus that it is a syndrome that requires like immediate action. So we don't really know a lot about it, and we're only in the last 5 to 10 years taking this type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome a lot more seriously. And one of the reasons why we're looking at metabolic syndrome much more seriously, it used to be, okay, so you are no longer responding to having insulin being secreted, you are insulin resistant, and that was the end of the discussion. But those individuals that were left untreated succumbed to having like high blood glucose levels. They developed this type 2 diabetes, and then they also developed cardiovascular disease. And doctors were kind of at an impasse. Like, why does having high blood glucose and this type 2 diabetes lead to having cardiovascular disease? And I've kind of implicated that in one of the slides right before we had this break. And how does it affect inflammation? And how does inflammation play a role in this whole process? And how do we try to treat this disorder if we're looking at this sort of as a syndrome? Do you have any questions on anything that I've covered so far before we go on? Anything that you want to just confirm or things that you are curious about assessing?
I'm just a little bit confused on whether we're using metabolic
So
interchangeably.
I am, for this lecture, going to use them interchangeably. So I have like metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. There are some researchers who are dramatically opposed to that. So they feel like metabolic syndrome is its own thing and that type 2 diabetes is just a subclass of metabolic syndrome. But I'm going to use them interchangeably. Any other questions that I can clarify for you now? No? So again, if we're looking at this, the old name for metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes is syndrome X, and I'll get into some of the history about that later on. And one of the things that makes this kind of unique is that compared to type 1 diabetes, where we don't see this, is this idea of central obesity. These are extreme cases of central obesity, but you can see like the shape above the waistline or below the waistline. We're talking about having fat distribution above the waistline, and it's an important discussion to have. One of the other things that's very, very routinely observed in metabolic syndrome is high blood pressure. And again, I've been having high blood pressure for a while, so that's been something that I've been dealing with off and on for a number of years. But the fact that I now also have diabetes means that I have to be extra careful about my health and my high blood pressure, having high triglyceride levels, low HDL cholesterol levels, as well as that insulin resistance. These are some of the major features that make up metabolic syndrome. Okay, so you need to have all of these to have metabolic syndrome. Are we clear on that? So if I were to ask you as a multiple choice test question or as a short answer question to list all of the different factors that define metabolic syndrome, this is the list that you would be giving back to me. All right, so I'm going to ask, and you can answer freely, however you want. So do you believe that I have central obesity? As I suck in my gut a little bit more. Central obesity, do I have that? So not by the measures that I'm going to go through, but actually I do have central obesity because I wanted to check, and it was important for me to check. And I don't have like that beer belly or that sort of central adiposity here, but I actually do have a lot of fat on the inside of my gut lining. And I'll show you that a little bit, not mine, but I'll show you that a little bit later on. And in fact, this is what we're going to spend some time on at the beginning of the next class. Does anyone know what this is? Like, this is not an MRI. Even though you get to see really high details in the brain, this is not an MRI. Do you know what kind of scan this is? Any ideas? Yes. This is a DEXA scan. So thanks, Kaylin. So this is a DEXA scan, and it allows you to use different types of X-rays. And I'll give you this slide at the beginning of the next lecture, and it will be a way to review what we talked about in this lecture. And you can see different types of tissue, like muscle and bone in white here. And you can also see in yellow the fat. And you can actually see very clearly the fat that is subcutaneous, just under the skin. And you can also see the fat that accumulates inside the abdomen, the abdominal cavity, where we normally have like your colon and your intestines. Normally, we don't have a lot of fat there, and we have a system of ligaments that kind of suspend the different organs from like the liver as well as from different parts of the abdominal lining. And you can see on a healthy individual here on the right, we don't have a lot of yellow. And these are where we would see the colon and where we would see some of the other abdominal structures. And you can see in this individual, not only do they have subcutaneous fat, so they have increased the subcutaneous fat under their skin, but packing the intestinal organs, the intra-abdominal organs, everything that you would have under like your liver, you can actually see that there's a lot of adipose tissue that's been deposited here. And this is that central adiposity. This is that increase that we see in metabolic syndrome. And this is really important because the classic measurements that we would use, that I'm going to show you in the next few slides, would indicate for most cases that I actually don't have central adiposity. But when I have a DEXA scan, I can actually see that there's a lot of fat deposition that's going on around my abdominal organs. And so we need to rethink some of those standard measures that were adopted, not necessarily for East Asian, South Asian populations. We need to rethink some of those standards, and I'll get into that a little bit later on. And these body types, where you deposit the fat is important. So if you are depositing that fat above the waistline, and this is above the waistline, this is intra-abdominal, but it's still above the waistline, this is not good for you. This is unhealthy fat. Below the waistline, if you have subcutaneous fat deposition, that's okay. It's not as detrimental. There are no studies that actually show that this is bad for your health. And most people think that this is a good form of fat deposition. So having this pear shape versus this apple shape, which has a technical name that I'll get into in the next few slides, is incredibly important. So again, before I go on, do you have any questions or things that you want to know more about, or things that I can clarify, or that you want to confirm now? Yes?
So you're saying that like measurements of
Yes, that's correct. So not for everyone. We need to rethink that. So it's an easy measurement, which is why we do BMI Waist circumference is an easy measurement because everyone can have like a tape measure. Everyone knows where their waist is. And that's one of the reasons why it was a standard of practice and why we have a lot of data on it. But it may not be an accurate reflection of different ethnic populations, which is always a critique of like primary literature. Are there any other questions? Yes, Omar. The viscera is another way. It's a great question. Thanks for confirming that. Visceral fat meaning like intra-abdominal fat, the fat that I've just been talking about. Anything else that I can clarify for you or not clear or no? So this central adiposity or central obesity is one of the key features or the markers for metabolic syndrome. Technically, we measure this in standardized ways, and we use these standardized measurements like BMI, this body mass index, easy to assess. Like all you need to do is measure someone's height, measure their weight. It's a simple measurement, but it's not a good measurement. Even the waist circumference is not a good measurement, and we need to rethink this. So DEXA scans, if your doctor's office had it, this would be like the gold standard. Everyone should have like a DEXA scan once every 2 years. Having it too often is also not good, but a DEXA scan every 2 years would be ideal. But they're incredibly expensive. And up until about 5 years ago, like in Toronto, there were only 2 hospitals that actually had DEXA scans. And now we have many more hospitals and clinics that actually can perform this procedure. So one of the ways in which we measure central adiposity before was to get a measure of what is known as this BMI, or this body mass index. It's used by most healthcare professionals. And in fact, when I visited my family doctor, it was one of the first things that they did was to measure my weight, look at my height, do the waist circumference. So this standards. And then I had a little chat with him, and then he told me to get lost. Like, hey, I'm the doctor, you're not. So we were talking a little bit about what other measurements do you often do. But BMI is still a standard, and you'll all like get weighed in, you'll all have your height taken, etc. It is limited, so athletes like they totally throw off the BMI, and it totally throws off the distribution of fat. There are a lot of assumptions made about BMI, so it's that your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared, and this gives you sort of your BMI measurement. And then there's a scale, a standardized scale that you refer back to based on your own measurements. Then, of course, this waist circumference, so 40-inch waist circumference. Again, not to brag, I'm not at 40 yet, but by every sort of measure, I have that central adiposity. I don't have the 40-inch waist circumference. And again, for women, it's lower at 35. And even with the waist to hip ratio, so you measure the circumference of the waist versus the circumference of the hips. If it's greater than 9, then you're at risk. If you're greater than 0.85 for women, you're at risk of having metabolic syndrome. But again, I would fall outside of those norms, even though when I had a scan done, I have a lot of central adiposity. So we need to rethink this a little bit. So again, let me ask you this question, since you're a little bit shy, and maybe you can help me a little bit. Do you need to memorize this chart? Not sure. You hope not. Okay, good answer. I like that answer, by the way. I'd like you to know parts of this chart. So I'd like you to make sure that you are aware of being underweight. So being underweight is actually not better for your health. I'm going to show you this in the next slide as well. So you actually are at an increased risk of certain health-related problems. This is typically known as cachexia. This is usually brought on by muscle wasting, but if you're just simply losing too much weight, you'll also have cachexia as well. And this is where your BMI is under 18.5. This is, again, a standardized measure. If you're between 18.5 and 24.9, you are at normal weight. You don't have any health-related problems. Again, standardized. And then if you're above 25, which is the last measurement that I want you to know, then you're at risk. And you're at risk for a number of different things, including metabolic syndrome in most cases. Okay? And those are the only numbers I want you to know. Under 18.5, 18.5 to 24.9, and then 25 and over, and what sort of problems they have. Again, these are standardized measures. These do not include like every single ethnic, cultural group, but these are standardized measures of health that have been used and are still in use today. If you are at no risk of increased mortality, this mortality ratio should be at 1. So if you're in this level here, and think about this in terms of the BMI, and we're looking at BMI here at the bottom, 18.5 to 24.9, I said you're at the healthiest that you can be, and you have very, very little mortality risk. If you are under this value, so you're underweight, and you have a BMI of under 18.5, you actually have an increased mortality ratio. You're at increased risk of death through things like digestive disorders occurring. So your digestive system is actually much more at risk if you're underweight, as well as your lungs. Your pulmonary system is also more at risk if your BMI is lower. As you go above 25 and you start developing metabolic syndrome, your mortality risk goes up. Your mortality ratio goes above 1. This means that you're more and more likely. You're 1.5 times more likely to die than someone who's healthy. You are 2 times more likely to die than someone who's healthy. And the reasons why you are more likely to die involve things like the cardiovascular system. You might develop gallbladder issues. You might develop complications through diabetes, not just type 1 diabetes, but any form of diabetes, which is, again, cardiovascular, it's neuropathy, like all of those different things. So we need to reassess what we are thinking about in terms of this, these values here. But these are standardized values, and based on the chart that I showed you before, as well as these boxes here for underweight, or the risk factors if you're overweight, I'd like you to make sure that you connect the previous slide and the data on this slide. You will get tested on it, so make sure that you're spending time. If it's like review for you, wonderful. If it's new, please make sure you're spending time on it. Any questions or things I can clarify before we move on? No? All right. So again, one of the things that I'm going to be talking about, metabolic syndrome, so interchangeably as Omar and others were asking, no, it wasn't Omar. Was it Omar? No, sorry, it was Dustin. So type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, I'm using them all interchangeably. So you are going to build up a lot of glucose in the bloodstream. Building up glucose in the bloodstream leads to a whole host of other things, damage to key organs like the eyes, the retinopathy that I showed you earlier. Your eyes are very, very sensitive to high glucose levels. Like even if you have high glucose for a few days, your eyes will they will actually be affected. Your kidneys are very susceptible to high glucose levels. Can you think of a reason why? Just curious if you remember anything from physiology. Remember anything from physiology? PSL 301 maybe? If you took PSL 301, yes?
The kidneys play a key role in
Yeah, reabsorption of glucose. Remember the proximal convoluted tubule? You get 2/3 of the reabsorption of glucose occurring. When there's too much glucose and it's trying to reabsorb all of that all the time, those transport systems actually come under oxidative stress, and this is one of the reasons why your kidneys are susceptible to high glucose levels. The nerves we'll talk about later, and the liver tries its best to remove as much of that glucose as possible, and in fact, it tries to convert as much of it as possible, and it turns out that it converts a lot of it into fat and stores fat in the liver, which is not good for the liver as well. And we'll talk about all of these pathways in more detail in the next lecture. And of course, cardiovascular disease, which is like a really big factor that is associated with metabolic syndrome. Any questions on this before we go on? Okay, so these are all of the physical exams that we would typically do. These are, again, standardized measures, and we have different ways and different standards from different institutions. So we would measure blood pressure. So this is in addition to the things that we talked about before for metabolic syndrome, so this is more physical data that would indicate that someone has metabolic syndrome. So blood pressure being elevated above 130 for the systolic, over 85 or higher for the diastolic, that might indicate that you have metabolic syndrome, and is one of the things that we often see in metabolic syndrome. So for me, that was a clear check mark. In fact, my blood pressure is even over 140, so like it's a really big check mark. The World Health Organization has different standards, and so they require that it's over 140 and over 90, and the American Medical Association, their values are a little bit lower at 130 over 85. BMI, again, it would have to fall in the range of over 25 for you to have metabolic syndrome. The waist circumference over 40, but I don't qualify there. My BMI is normal as well, so I still fall below that level there. So I don't really fall under this category by these things. The appearance of skin tags might be an indicator that you have metabolic syndrome as well. Your skin gets affected, your skin starts to proliferate in strange ways if you have like high glucose for long periods of time, plus inflammation. So skin tags are one of those things. I won't share whether or not I had skin tags or not, but skin tags are something that my family physician and I discussed as well. A miscoloring of the skin, so the pigmentation of your skin may also be affected if you have like high glucose, and oftentimes it becomes a darkening of skin, and this acanthosis nigricans is often associated with metabolic syndrome as well. If you get patches of your skin that get darker, and we'll talk about skin in the next section, then it's something to also link with potential metabolic syndrome. So not only do you have like high glucose and inflammatory markers, but you also have these physical exam values that are affected as well. Any questions on this before we go on? Yes?
How many of these factors would you have to have in order to qualify?
To qualify. You don't want to qualify for this, so let's just get that one straight. Don't qualify for this. I think that all of these together, like they kind of give you a more holistic picture. So for example, my BMI falls in the normal category still. My blood pressure is not normal. My waist circumference doesn't meet the standard values, but that's mainly because I'm from a different ethnic group, and we might have to rethink those values. So a waist circumference of 40 might not be adequate for like East Asian, South Asian population, so we might have to rethink this. So it's not like these are things that you want as a checklist, but if you have more of these, then it's more likely that you would have to also start thinking about metabolic syndrome. Yes? Sorry? Are lipomas? Not so much. At least not in the early stages of metabolic syndrome. So lipomas being a form of cancer or a form of abnormal growth of some of the fat tissue. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those forms of cancer later on. Any other questions? No? Okay. So those are the physical exams, and if you are worried at all, and oftentimes these are done at the same time anyway, so you go in, you get your physical exam, and then you get your blood drawn, and because I was worried enough about some of the symptoms that I actually had a fasting blood glucose, so I fasted overnight, went in to see my doctor, I asked for the blood to be drawn, and he sent it off, and then he called me back in after about a week or so. If your fasting blood glucose levels are above 110 milligrams per deciliter, or you might see it as 5.6 millimoles per liter, then you might also be considered in that metabolic syndrome category. Triglycerides over 150, HDL below 40, and these are the more common ones that you get tested for as well. So does anyone know what the alpha-1C or the HbA1c is? What is that? Yeah? Perfect. So at any given point in time, my blood glucose levels are going to fluctuate. So if you went up and had some of those snacks, even if they were healthy fruit, your blood glucose is going up and down a little bit. So how do you know if even after fasting, like if your blood glucose is too high or too low? And so this HB1C looks at the glycosylation or the glucose that's put onto the hemoglobin of your red blood cells over the course of like 3 months, because that's sort of the average lifespan of a red blood cell. And it looks at how much sugar has your blood been exposed to over this past 3 months, not just today, but over the past 3 months. And again, if these are too high, it's a good indicator that you have type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance, etc. So again, for me, my lab evaluations had like high fasting glucose levels. My triglycerides were, for the most part, not in the same categories. My triglycerides were high. My HDL levels were still pretty good. They were above 40. And my HB alpha 1C also indicated I had like high glucose levels for at least the last 3 months. It was above normal. And does anyone know what this is? Because last year on the first term test or the final, I can't remember, I had asked this. I made the assumption that you had all learned this, but this C-reactive peptide high sensitivity, or HS, what is it a marker for? Because this is the first time we're seeing this in metabolic syndrome. What is this a marker for? Any ideas? How about someone else? Yes. That's okay. Who is the disembodied voice? Wait. Inflammation, yes. So this is a marker for inflammation, and this C-reactive peptide, the levels for this were actually high too. And again, now we're not just looking at glucose. We're not just looking at things related to the cardiovascular system. We're also looking at things related to the inflammatory process, which is what I showed you. All of these things are related together. And again, a lot of these different proteins like CRP, if it's in your bloodstream, it's been released from the liver in response to cytokines, and cytokines are a marker for inflammation, right? So this goes back to what your colleague was mentioning earlier. So again, you need to have physical exams, lab exams, in order to make sure that you have like a certain form of metabolic syndrome, or if you might suspect that metabolic syndrome is going on. So, you guys like calculations, don't like calculations? Don't like calculations? Not at all? No? So if I put this on your first term test, you won't be happy? I mean, it's a pretty simple calculation, right? I'm hoping. So one of the ways that people use these different lab values, so these tie directly into the previous slide. You get your triglycerides measured, you get your HDL levels measured. Any one of these might be an indicator for metabolic syndrome. But in addition to that, a more accurate and a more sensitive measure is to look at the ratio between your triglycerides and HDL. So you get your triglyceride levels, they could be high, but your HDL levels might not be at risk. And so one of the key things is, if you look at the ratio of the triglycerides and the HDL, and if it's above 3, then you suspect that there is insulin resistance. If it's less than 3, it could happen for a number of reasons, but it may not, or it's most likely not going to be a result of insulin resistance. So these clinical values are going to be important, especially when we start talking about type 1 diabetes, and type 1 diabetes has its own sorts of clinical values. Any questions on this before we go on? So just to confirm, so I'll do the confirmation this time. Do you need to know this slide? Yes. Do you need to know about this ratio of triglycerides to HDL? Yes. Do you need to know information from this previous slide? Yes, because they all kind of tie in together about triglycerides, about HDL, about the ratio of triglycerides to HDL, and how we're trying to get into identifying metabolic syndrome in different individuals. I told you earlier the distribution of fat is important, and in fact the body shape and body types actually have names. So you could be a type 1 and this is the most common, and this is where it's evenly distributed throughout the entire body, and this means that you're a type 1 body type. You could have an android body type where you have most of the fat deposition occurring at the level of the trunk, so the center part of your body. If you are a gynoid body type, it means that the type 3 gynoid individuals have most of their fat deposition occurring in the lower body part. Is that good or bad based on what I told you before? Apple shape, pear shape? Pear shape, good, bad? Probably better than being an apple shape. And then type 4, which is also considered android because it's part of the trunk, but this is a special subtype where it's mainly found in the abdomen. It's not just the entire trunk, so your chest and abdomen, that's your trunk, but most of it is centered around the abdomen, and most of it is intra-abdominal. And if you have a lot of fat deposition there, it's not a good thing. Are we clear on the body types? Okay, are we good? Do you expect to see it on your term test? I feel like we're seeing Stockholm syndrome. Like I have you all. I'm not sure. So yes, you should expect to study this. If it's new to you, then spend a little bit of time going over this. This is pure memorization, so make sure that you spend time on this slide as well. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail right now. We're going to go through this in more detail when we look at type 1 diabetes. I wanted to mention a few things on this slide. When I mention a word like this, which no one asked about previously, but I'm quite curious about, when I say postprandial, what does that mean? Yes. Yeah, so after a meal, after eating. So postprandial, if you see it on a term test question, I won't be able to give you the definition for it. I expect you to know it. We've just covered it. So postprandial, after a meal, insulin released from these pancreatic beta cells. And in addition to that, the only other thing I want you to know right now, because we'll come back to this later, is that normal levels of blood glucose, because you know what's abnormal, above 120 is abnormal. Normal levels of blood glucose should be about 90 milligrams per deciliter. So this is what we call euglycemia, or normal levels of blood glucose. So when you see this popping up in a test question, I won't be able to define that for you. You should know what euglycemia means, and you should know the value for euglycemia, meaning that it's about 90 milligrams per deciliter. Any questions on this before we go on? Are we good? Are we not good? Tell me if we're not good. Tell me if we're good. Are we good to go on? Yes. So for most individuals, postprandial no, because it's going to spike. So this is like resting levels or or fasting levels. Like you'll always have like spikes in your glucose and your insulin levels at different times of the day. This is like again fasting levels. So I think this is one of the last slides that I'm going to talk about today, and then we'll kind of wrap things up, and then we'll try to make sure we're all on the same page. So what we're looking at right now is this metabolic syndrome, which I've also called type 2 diabetes, also called insulin resistance. In response to a meal, your pancreatic beta cells are still there. There has been no autoimmune dysfunction. They respond normally by releasing insulin. The problem is your muscle cells, your fat cells, your hepatic cells that normally will respond to insulin don't do so. So when insulin is there, instead of binding to the insulin receptor and causing the expression of the glucose transporter to be on the cell surface, because normally it's found inside the cell, and then in response to insulin binding to its receptor, it translocates up to the cell surface, and then it allows for the transport of glucose into the cell more effectively. We don't have this response that is normally occurring. And what we're going to see is that this entire cascade is one that we can use to develop different types of drugs and treatments for insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, potentially for metabolic syndrome, to kind of put things back in balance. Because this insulin receptor, which is what you're seeing here, is not able to respond normally. Something goes wrong. Insulin is there and it binds, but it just does not cause this signaling cascade where we have PI3 kinase being activated. And PI3 kinase has two different subunits, the P85 subunit and the P110 subunit. And something goes wrong. This normal PI3 kinase activity is not triggered in cells that have become insulin resistant. And so we don't get the activation of phospholipase C. We don't get the breakdown of different phospholipids, and we don't get the translocation as a result of this glucose transporter up to the cell surface. And again, we'll talk about all of these things in the next lecture. So I think I'm going to try to wrap things up there and then begin with the next lecture on some of these things that I've left behind. So I want us to think a little bit about this, and then you can come back and discuss this next week. So I just mentioned in this slide that because we know that there's a faulty pathway involving this key enzyme PI3 kinase, and because we know that we don't get GLUT4 or glucose transporter 4 expression on the cell surface, because we don't activate phospholipase C, we don't get this translocation up to the cell surface, we could use drugs to stimulate this pathway in artificial ways. But if you were thinking about it from a physiological perspective, what would you do to kind of keep this either in check or under control, or to stimulate this pathway in a different way? So is there another way to stimulate PI3 kinase? So what could we do? Any ideas? How would you control metabolic syndrome? So let's assume for a second that you care about my health. I'm hoping you do. And let's assume for a second that some of the alternatives that were offered to me, like you need to get this under control, you need to control and take metformin, you need to take this, you need to take that. Let's assume for the time being I don't want to do that. What are some of the other options that I can use to control either my blood glucose levels, my insulin responsiveness, or turn on this pathway? Anything that you can think of that would make my metabolic syndrome less aggressive? Any ideas? Save my life. Yes? Okay, so exercise, and we'll learn how exercise might trigger this pathway a little bit later on. So that's an excellent suggestion. Anything else? Yes? Sympathetic activation. Can I ask why you went that route? PI3, GPCRs, okay. Okay, maybe. We'll come back to the nervous system a little bit later, but good thinking. Anything else? So basically you want to scare the crap out of me every single lecture. Okay, awesome. Yes?
Changing your diet.
Changing my diet, okay, great. And we're going to talk about diet, fasting, intermittent fasting, the impact of intermittent fasting on health as well as disease and metabolic syndrome. And that will be the beginning of the next lecture as we transition into type 1 diabetes and autoimmunity. Anything else? I don't like fasting, by the way. Anything else? Exercise. I don't like exercise either. Anything else? Yes? Exercise mimetics. So taking drugs that make my body think that I've exercised. I like that idea. Do you know of any?
There's a dietary one called resveratrol.
Okay. So we'll talk about some of these different compounds that are found in foods, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture as well. But I want us to think about these different aspects of health and disease. So we'll talk more about metabolic syndrome. We'll talk about different non-pharmacological treatments for it and how they might work through these pathways and others. And then we'll talk about type 1 diabetes and what we now know about autoimmunity in type 1 diabetes. And then we'll start thinking about how having high blood glucose can change the color of your skin, why it makes your immune system less likely to ward off pathogens, and why all of this is kind of interrelated as our first platform. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap things up for for the time being today. And if I could really strongly suggest, if any of you are willing to either help out with study guides or learn how to do the streaming for this lecture, it doesn't take a lot of time and effort, but we do need volunteers to help with that. So if you can just hang behind for a few minutes, have a great week. I'll see you all next Tuesday. And yeah, just have like a good week. Get out and enjoy yourselves. Just give me 1 second. I'm just going to turn this off.